Today on The Nation Speaks, we have a dire drug problem. About 100,000 people will die this year in America from an overdose, despite 50 years of a war on drugs. So what's gone wrong? Our two guests have answers, but very different ones. Neil Wood spent 14 years undercover in the UK, fighting drug gangs, until it changed his outlook. Derek Maltz, former head of special operations for the DEA, says drugs like fentanyl have changed the landscape. Then in America Q&A, what do you think of legalizing hard drugs? Finally, in our second America Q&A, we ask, when was the last time you tried something new for the first time? Hello and welcome to The Nation Speaks. I'm your host, Cindy Drucare. For 50 years, law enforcement has waged a war on drugs, with no signs of victory in sight and far too many casualties. Clearly, something's not right, but what? If anyone thinks they have easy solutions, they probably don't appreciate the scope of the problem. Highly determined billion-dollar drug cartels, rival cartels, international warfare, user demand, mental health, addiction, accidental overdose, public education, prescription drugs, synthetic drugs, secretly laced drugs, aggressive online marketing, all the levels and jurisdictions of law enforcement involved, corruption, the list goes on and on. Today, we hear from two drug warriors with years of bona fide on-the-ground experience, but very different conclusions about what should be done. With us now from the UK is Neil Woods, who spent 14 years on the ground undercover infiltrating drug gangs by pretending to be a homeless drug user, and that experience changed how he sees policing the drug problem. He's the author of two books, his popular memoir, Good Cop, Bad War, and Drug Wars. Neil, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Cindy.
So people in the UK may be more familiar with your story, but I'm not sure about here in the US. If you can start by putting us in your shoes, what does it look like to be an undercover drug cop?
Well, I mean, I used to travel around the United Kingdom infiltrating drug dealing gangs in different inner city areas. And in order to do that, I would learn from the people around me and dress like them. So I would be hanging around with really vulnerable people, people who are either homeless or living in squats or on the edge of that kind of world, people who had a real significant problem with drugs. And the reason that I spent time with them is because, well, for one, vulnerable people are the easiest to manipulate, but also they had the best connections. They could introduce me further up the ladder to the sort of regional suppliers of the drugs, and those were the targets of the operation. And it tended to be for 6 or 7 months at a time. It was exhausting. I was quite sure I was going to get murdered on several occasions. But, you know, for the most of that time, I really believed in what I was doing. Even though I knew I was causing harm to vulnerable people, I still felt that that was justified because, you know, at the end of the operation, you catch the bad guys, right? So for a lot of the time, I believed in what I was doing. And that's the problem with our current drug policy is it's all about belief, you know, belief in what we're doing right, rather than actually looking at the evidence.
Give us a sense of how you started to see things differently. What changed?
One particular gang, a very infamous gang I infiltrated called the Burger Bar Boys. They were using sexual violence as part of their reputation building. You know, they were doing all the other gangster stuff like kidnappings and maimings and shootings. For every day of that operation, I felt in imminent risk every single day of those 7 months. And so I was very pleased nearing the end of the operation when I'd gathered evidence against 96 people, the 6 main gangsters plus 90 other people, all of their support, you know, their backroom staff, the sex workers who were working for them, all sorts of people. And there were hundreds of police involved in the enforcement stage of that operation. And I spoke to the intelligence officer who was keeping his ear to the ground after the dust had settled and everyone was arrested. And he said to me, "Yep, we managed to interrupt the drug supply for a full 2 hours. 7 months of work, being quite convinced I was going to die. I was stripped at gunpoint at one point. It's impossible to ignore that kind of evidence. And I have to make something very clear. Now that I am fighting organised crime in a more effective way, now that I'm part of the drug policy reform movement, As part of LEAP, that's my organisation, I'm part of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, I speak to cops all over the world, and they've all got the same story. They've all got similar stories, from Baltimore to Melbourne in Australia, to Cape Town in South Africa. We've all had these same experiences, that what we do is futile. However, it's worse than futile. I mean, futility would be bad enough. But actually what we're doing by this policing activity in these drug markets is we're causing more violence. We are increasing the power and ruthlessness of organised crime. Now, I should probably explain what I mean by that. Look at what happens in the USA. You have the DEA, and they are incredibly good at catching drug dealers. They're incredibly good at making drug seizures. They'll seize kilos, week in, week out. But that's part of the problem, because no matter what drugs policing happens, the market is never reduced. The size of that market is never reduced. So what police do is they change the shape of it. And when you're so hardworking and so good at what they do is they sharpen the sword of organised crime. And wherever police create a gap in the market, such as the one that I've just described to you, violence, more often than not, follows that policing activity, because that gap in the market creates opportunities. And you will upset the gang that you've caught, but you make other gangs very, very happy indeed. And actually, quite often, it's the information from rival gangs that causes the activity of the police in the first place.
Joining us now is Derek Maltz, who spent 28 years in drug law enforcement, starting out on the streets of New York until finally spending almost a decade as head of special operations for the Drug Enforcement Administration. Derek, welcome.
Thank you, Cindy.
It's been 50 years now since the war on drugs, since the early 70s. What do you think has been the impact overall? And I ask this because one characterization of what's gone on is that you can take down bad guys, but, chop off one head and another grows. And, natural selection, it might be a more ruthless head. So from where you sit and having been in that driver's seat for so long, what do you think the impact has been of the war on drugs?
Well, right now we're in historic level drug crisis. We've never seen this in the history of the country, but it's quite different now because we have synthetic drugs being made in labs in China, in Mexico, and other parts of the world, poisoning our population at record levels. But what I'd like to say is that, law enforcement's out there every day trying to keep America safe. And every time they make a seizure, like for an example of fentanyl or fentanyl pills, they're saving thousands of lives. Just as an example, like this vial here is only 30 grams of salt. If that was 30 grams of fentanyl, it could kill 15,000 Americans if it was pure fentanyl. So it's very, very addictive. The crisis is getting worse because the traffickers are getting more and more sophisticated. They're taking advantage of weaknesses around the globe, and they're using advanced technology, and they're doing a good job from their perspective. Obviously, from America's perspective, we're losing way too many lives.
The last guest I had in terms of drug bust, what he would say is that you take those drugs off the street, but that order is just going to get backfilled and that supply is still going to be there. It just means that particular batch didn't get into the hands of anyone, but the drug dealers, the gangs are ready to make the next supply. What do you say to that?
Well, the Mexican cartels run a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, and there are plenty of individuals working in these organizations, and they're in the business to maximize profits. They're going to take advantage of the addicted population, and they're now taking advantage as they've employed a strategic and marketing plan to go after our young, our 13-year-olds, our 15-year-olds that are sitting on their computers, and they're taking advantage, trying to get them addicted so they can make more and more funding. But a bigger problem is with the wide open border, they're taking advantage of the weak border security, and business is booming now. But I go back to, I used to work a lot of very pure heroin cases in the 90s and the 2000s, and every time we took a bag of heroin off the streets, you knew that you were saving a life. So from law enforcement's perspective, they're trying to save lives, they're trying to make seizures, they're trying to disrupt global networks like the Mexican cartels as an example, and they've done a tremendous job. Unfortunately, there's too many people addicted to drugs, and we can't get services in America, and there's no education.